Hi, this is an overview on painting. Sometimes it's kind of important to start with the basics. So I'm just going to go through the slides and give you some examples and occasionally pause it and actually show you some of the paint. This isn't perfect. You're going to occasionally hear my neighbors. You might hear my dog barking. It drives me crazy if I have to stop all the time. So I'm just going to keep going. So let me start here. It's completely cross-cultural, multicultural, um, one of those things that people inherently want to do. Children like to draw, paint, and certainly we have cave paintings going back 32,000 years, maybe even more. But in any case, the first images of cave paintings are largely animals. And they were probably done for perhaps a good luck with the hunt. They might have even been a teaching device. They might have simply been a way of decorating their environment. We're still doing that. And in other words, we don't really know. But these are from Chauvet Cave in France. A lot of important cave paintings are indeed in France. Spain too, but there's a lot of them there. So we have found them in all different continents. We have found them in Argentina. We have found them again in France and Spain. Certainly, we also have examples of this like Anasazi Indians, and that's in the United States. So in any case, this sort of artwork is something that started early. And some of these handprints particularly fascinate me. In fact, I have a whole lecture on just hands in art. And why? Now, sometimes it's what we call a positive imprint, which is where I put a lot of paint on my hand and I press it on the wall or I press it on a piece of paper. Then you're leaving a positive imprint. There's also negative imprints where you put your hand against the wall and then you spray paint, make your hand all messy, but you're going to leave a negative handprint on the wall. So when you take it away, you'll have the tracing of your hand. So again, a weird little detail in art history. Encaustic. Encaustic is another type of paint. And encaustic is done with wax and hot pigment. It was something that was done in Rome. It was done in Pompeii. The Fayum mummies are an example of the encaustic method. And it's remarkable because these paintings, many of them, again, they're on these mummies. And they're so pretty realistic looking. But what's remarkable is they're a couple thousand years old and you can still see some remarkable details when you look at them. Still life with eggs and thrushes. This is 79, so this is first century. And this is the villa of Julia Felix. And these are carbonized eggs from Pompeii. A rare find. Pompeii was given we're given some warnings because the volcano had been active. But in any case, I don't think they realized how very violent it was going to become. And in many cases, it just covers up life as they knew it. So we know how people were positioned when they passed away. We sometimes know what they were eating because it was actually left on the table. You can see exactly what they were doing. You can see there was a thief that was trying to run away with a bunch of silver. Then again, all sorts of details we can get from Pompeii. Some of the earliest examples of painting as far as Western art is certainly in places like Pompeii. So generally, organic material does not survive. If you've wondered how did eggs possibly survive, and again, the main reason being it was covered in 20 feet of ash. A lot of people are very surprised when they're in a museum and they're looking at all this Pompeii glass. They're going, how has this lasted so long? Well, it lasted pretty well when it was covered in ash. And so that's why we do have a fair amount of examples of glass from Pompeii. Cimabue, a Madonna and child enthroned with two angels. The Virgin was often represented as enthroned and surrounded by angels, a celestial monarch, and we're starting again to see the development of space. We're starting to see a sense that the painting looks like it goes in, that the space is actually going in a bit. And it has a medieval quality. It doesn't have the naturalism that you're going to get later as time progresses. So Cimabue, he is right in there, medieval art, pre-Renaissance, proto-Renaissance, right before. Virgin and child enthroned. This is done with tempera. Tempera, egg tempera, it's sometimes referred to. It's not as realistic as oil. It's hard to get the realism of oil unless you're Andrew Wyeth, who did a remarkable job of it. But in any case, this was a type of paint that they were using in the 13th century. So tempera on panel, which is tempera on wood, and this is a medieval icon. Iconography equals signs and symbols in art. You'll hear that a few times this semester. You should remember that. So Giotto, the Ognissanti Madonna, this is from the Uffizi. Very famous work associated with the earlier sense of space, architectural space in particular. Again, there's that sense that the picture has a sense of space to it, like you can look into it. It looks more realistic, it's not as flat. So sometimes in art history, I think that my job is describing art, and to a large extent it is, but you also will learn some of the terms. So Giotto's Madonna and Giotto's Arena Chapel. This is the presentation of the Virgin. It's often shown as a fairly realistic example of Giotto's work. So he is credited with, him and Cimabue were credited with this idea of developing the use of space and perspective, and that continues for a very long time until it gets quite realistic. Wet and dry fresco, wall painting. Buon fresco means good fresco, true fresco, wet fresco, and it is applied to a deep wall. The color tends to go into it deeper, so it tends to be a little bit more preserved when it's older. Fresco secco means dry fresco. The pigment is combined with binders such as egg yolk, tempera, oil paint, or wax, hot wax, encaustic. So again, those are the two types of fresco painting. This is Buonarroti. Michelangelo is, as we know him, Michelangelo Buonarroti, creation of Adam. This is the center panel of the Sistine Chapel, by far the most famous image in the Sistine Chapel. Arguably the Last Judgment is as well. But here we have the artist must start applying his colors on the wet intonaco, which is the painting plaster layer. As soon as it has been prepared and laid on the surface, the colors can be absorbed deeply. So this is why they tend to be preserved pretty deeply. Now, it wasn't too long ago, they did do a complete redo of the Sistine Chapel, and colors that they thought were brownish were actually pretty clear. Now, Leonardo was not always successful with the fresco method. Leonardo was regularly experimenting in art history. So Leonardo was experimenting with the medium of fresco, and he was learning it, and he was trying out new things. Sometimes that's not always successful. And indeed, in his own lifetime, it was deteriorating. Now, in art history, a lot of art historians are very dismissive of his Last Supper. They basically say that virtually none of it is left that is signature Leonardo da Vinci. And that's possibly true because it has been redone and has been redone because it was so disintegrated. But even so, I think the central concepts are very much recognizable in Leonardo da Vinci's famous Last Supper. So he spent 3 years painting the work. He was not one to finish projects. When you would give him a project, he might leave it for a while and come back to it later. Great procrastinator. So not always dependable if he was commissioned for a work. And even so, brilliant man, very, very smart. So he basically spent a lot of time searching the streets of Milan for models that he felt looked like the apostles. And so he was particularly interested in very key models for Christ and Judas. So it was fairly common in this time period to paint into the walls of the building, but this was not a technique that he was well versed in at all. Also, the convent had humid conditions, and so on the refectory, which is where this painting is actually kind of above, and it was used as a dining area. It was even used as a stable, and at one point in time, it was actually even hit by a bomb. Collage. Collage is another medium, and it was first used by George Braque and Pablo Picasso. A work was made with various scraps, pieces of material such as cloth, paper, photos on a single composition. This is his still life with Cher Caning from 1911 and 12. And this includes pasted papers and this papier collé. And this was, again, what the term collage actually came from, is this idea of pasted papers. So this is part of his fairly early career. He was producing art in the late 1890s and for his entire life, and he led a nice long life. So this is actually fairly early work. George Braque was his friend, his neighbor. In fact, he even sometimes referred to him as his wife because they were together so much. These are examples of collage. Picasso's collage, Hannah Hawke's collage, and again, this idea of layering on these different papers, different materials. Sometimes you'll even use some paint or some glitter or some other types of material as well, and then we call it mixed media. But collage is something that many of us have done. Oftentimes, our first experience with collage was like in kindergarten, very, very early in our art experience. Tempera. Talked a little bit about that. We're going to talk a little bit more about it. So egg tempera, it is often called poster paints, but there is more professional grade tempera that like you can get at the Artist Warehouse or Blix or online. So it is, again, made with this fixative that is basically egg-based. As it states here, casein can also be used as a milky material, and they also add a touch of lime to it as well. And so this was the type of materials that Wyeth used. Now, Andrew Wyeth came from basically an artistic family. His father was N.C. Wyeth, a very important illustrator and artist as well. This is Andrew Wyeth's Braids, 1979, and it's not very large, 16 by 20, but the detail that he is able to get with tempera is just unbelievable. Usually you don't get this level of detail, except if you go into like perhaps oil. So now this is Gerard Richter's Betty. This is one of his works from 1988. Richter is today much more well known for his abstract works. He does a lot of scraping and moving the paint around. German artist. And there's some great videos online if you're so interested. But this is from 1988, and this is, again, it looks more like a photograph than an oil on canvas painting. And so here you can see the different mediums, and you can see that indeed, even though we look at Wyeth's work and we think it looks so realistic, we realize when we see a photograph that it's still not completely there. But even so, it's miraculous. Andrew Wyeth's most famous work, an iconic work, and that is Christina's World. Christina's World was, this was a young woman. If you look closely at her arms, she was a woman that was disabled. They think now that she probably had polio, and she could not walk. She got around by basically crawling about. And yet she was a very, very determined, strong young woman. Wyeth said she was very spiritual as well, and he admired her. So the repository, the place that you can see the original, is at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And so, so this was done in Maine. A lot of his works display something that we call regionalism. His work reflects the area around him. It's very, very prairies. There's a sense of almost a Midwest aesthetic, but it's certainly, he was producing these in Maine, and he was also working in Pennsylvania, but he was a very prolific artist, produced a great number of works, and is considered by many to be an extremely important American realist painter. So the challenge to me, he said, was to do justice to her extraordinary life, which most people would consider hopeless. He recorded this rural house with great detail. You can see it in the distance. I think it looks a little scary myself. But again, I think it's supposed to just look like a rural house, a homestead. And you can see all of these little details on her hair. And so his work is sometimes described as magic realism. Now, magic realism is something that I do a whole lecture on magic realism that can be taken even further. But you can certainly see that his work is very realistic. One of my students actually put it in a meme and sent it to me, and I thought this was pretty funny. She juxtaposed a meme of Scarlett Johansson falling that she took from something else. So anyway, I love it when people do that. Here's some other examples. I guess that was something that was circulating a number of years ago. But this has been an artwork that has basically been iconic. It is something that is very recognizable as American art, and indeed Andrew Wyeth particularly. This is also tempera on gesso and also on poplar panel, which means it's also on wood. And this is a very large work, 80 by 123 inches. It is the companion work to the also famous work, Birth of Venus. But these are at the Uffizi. And for 1482, they're really, really quite realistic. Here you have Botticelli is working in the early Renaissance, late medieval, but certainly you can see that the figures look more Renaissance, I think, than not. You're starting to see the human form looking very, very natural, not stiff, not with a very frontal formality. In the center, you have Aphrodite, and she is, of course, also known as the Roman version Venus, and she is the goddess of love, and here she is in spring, and on the edge you have Mercury. He's got his caduceus up there and he's holding back the wind. Mercury is a messenger god. And then you have the three graces that are also affiliated with the goddess as well. You also have Cupid, the son of Aphrodite or Venus. And here, right above Venus, you have this Cupid. And if you look close, he's blindfolded because love is blind. And it's as if he's about ready to shoot his arrow out into that crowd. We don't really know who he's going to hit. It's a really interesting detail. And then there is a nymph, again, she's sometimes described as being Flora. She's, again, this nymph, this kind of she's basically a handmaiden to the goddess, and she's standing right next to the goddess. And then you have the zephyr winds, that blue character right above, and he's abducting Flora, or sometimes identified as Chloris. The stories have similarities but differences. But in any case, this is also one of those works that is pretty famous. So Zephyr is abducting Chloris. We'll use that particular analysis. But again, some of the IDs are argued about. We don't really argue about Mercury. We don't really argue about the three graces or the fact that it's Venus. And then you have Cupid or Eros right above her, Eros, E-R-O-S. And so it is just this really, really gorgeous work, and it's large scale. And Botticelli was certainly very well known, and he was often commissioned work by the Medicis, so he was an important Renaissance artist. So, and yeah, again, here's some more of the background. So Zephyr in blue pursuing Chloris, who he rapes and later marries. That happened in mythology. It sounds completely gross to us, but it did happen in mythology. When you see an abduction in art history, sometimes the word abduction and rape can almost be used interchangeably, because it's as if to imply that nothing good is going to happen after this young woman gets taken away. So Flora, goddess of flowers, highly decorated gown, and it may have commemorated a Medici wedding, which I think it's pretty likely. It has that sense of spring. It's beautiful. It's luscious. And here you can see it in the museum. Again, it's very, very large. There's a lot of flowers, of course, symbol of love, spring, symbol of spring. And the figure of the goddess, the central figure, was actually modeled by Simonetta Vespucci, and she actually modeled for several of his works. He adored her, and indeed, she's a pretty famous model. So the caduceus, the symbolic staff of a herald, it's also sometimes used to signify medicine. Years ago, you could recognize drugstores because they'd have that symbol. I think Rexall drugs, indeed, old brand. Still, sometimes you can see that occasionally when you find one of those old ones. And So the Medicis, they were a powerful banking family, and there were many popes, and some of the popes were pretty horrible, but they also, as far as art history, they promoted projects. They were very competitive about who was going to commission the best artist. And art was important. It was drawing people into the churches, and it was also art that they decorated in their palaces. Now, did everybody have art in their homes? No. The wealthy had art in their homes. And then this is the sister painting, and probably a little bit more famous, and it's Birth of Venus. And so again, here you see the Zephyr looks definitely a little more unified with Chloris here. And then you see again the nymph, or this handmaiden, as she comes to wrap the Venus figure, the beautiful Venus figure, in essentially a towel, but it's a beautiful fabric. Toweling, as we know it, wasn't something that they used then. And so she's got this beautiful flowing hair. She shows up in all kinds of things. I'm sitting here looking at this, and this is my mouse. I put my little mouse on it, but in any case, she shows up in handbags and t-shirts, and you have seen this image or part of this image in art history. So again, there she is. This is Simonetta Vespucci. And let me move on. Oh, most important part. She's rising up out of the sea. And it's based on mythology. And basically, the Reader's Digest version is the genitals of Kronos were cast into the sea, and they foamed up, and the goddess grew out of the sea. And then we have indeed Venus here. And she doesn't come out of a baby. No, she is a fully grown, gorgeous woman. She's standing in what we call a contrapposto form, a slight S curve, and she is beautiful, and she is sweet, and she looks very, very modest. She had a lot of lovers. Again, she is perhaps one of the more promiscuous of the goddesses, but she was very much one of the most admired of the goddesses as well. And so here she is rising up out of her, on her shell. Roses, flowers, shells, these are some of the attributes. These are some of the ways we recognize her. She also is often shown with little cherubs around her children. Most famous, of course, is Eros or Cupid. Oil painting. Oil painting, of course, is used a great deal today. Slow drying paint, when pigments are mixed with oil, linseed oil, it dries hard, and it can have layer upon layer as well. And so they're generally opaque, which means they're not translucent. They're not like a wash. They can have a matte finish, a semi-gloss finish, or a glossy finish. And so, but oil paint was once used on some furniture as well. So it has a long history, but it really wasn't used a great deal until the Renaissance. And so by the time we get to the Renaissance, we see a number of the use of oil. Jan David's Heme, still life with fruit and lobster. And look at the details in these. These look so realistic. And I don't think you could get this level of realism with tempera. You wouldn't have the reflective quality as well. And so oftentimes when you look really close, you can even see the reflection of the studio in the paintings. You can sometimes, believe it or not, you can even see some artists actually have a reflection of themselves shown in some of the details. And this was something that was often done in 17th century still lifes. And so a still life means basically there's nothing in this picture that is alive. Now, sometimes there might be a butterfly or a fly or something like that. They're exempted. But the idea being it's objects, and so it is a still life. So oil on canvas, an example of trompe l'oeil, which means French for fools the eye. It looks so realistic, you almost think you can just reach out and touch it and take it away. Now, if you look here, everything looks a little bit past the sell date. You have things that look like, oh, I don't think I want to eat that. That's been sitting out on that buffet a little too long. Yes, and that's because it's sending the message that life is short. Seize the moment. Basically, that all is going to pass away. Those gorgeous flowers won't look so good next week. So this idea of basically, it's a vanitas. All is vanity. That, again, all these things will pass away. And this was an underlying feature of these still lifes. So now what are some of the items that are probably symbols? Symbols that life is essentially going to pass by. Well, there's a number of them. So, look at them for a bit. So iconography, again, I've said it before and you're going to hear it again, signs and symbols in art. And iconographical reading is where you basically look at it and try to see, what is the artist trying to tell me here? Is there some underlying meaning? Now, sometimes flowers are just flowers are just flowers. Like, for instance, Vincent van Gogh's beautiful sunflowers. He largely painted because his friend was going to come to visit, and he liked sunflowers, and he thought they were beautiful and thought they'd look beautiful in the room. And they did. So sometimes flowers are just flowers. And when we start overanalyzing them, you have to consider, what was the artist's intent? So here we have, again, some of the things look like they're not really fresh. You can see the peel of a lemon. You can see, of course, a lobster that looks like it may have been laying there a while. Some of the leaves look a little bit limp. So again, it very much is what we call a vanitas image. And so some of the symbols, well, of course, a lobster, if you take it out of the water, it's not going to be able to sustain life. That's a pretty clear symbol. A shell, of course, is essentially, if you've ever been to a funeral, and it's an open casket funeral, and you can see the corpse. That's just a shell. That person's not animated. That person is not alive. It's essentially a shell of that person. So in that way, you can make a connection between a shell and mortality. Fruit, flowers, again, you can definitely see a connection to mortality with that. Glass is fragile. Glass is breakable. You don't want to depend on glass always being there because it can easily break. Let me see they also like to use luxury items in these still lifes. So if they had a beautiful decanter or they had a beautiful candlestick, then they would use them in these breakfast scenes, or sometimes called breakfast scenes, or again, still life. So sometimes they're really quite lavish and beautiful. So there's also a sense of moderation. Not too much. Be moderate. You can have wine, but not too much wine. There is that underlying sense in a lot of Dutch still lifes. This is an artist that was influenced by Rembrandt. He was Dutch. There's Venetian glass here. Again, it's a luxury item. And again, this was a time period where you are having secular art, but there is still very much a very, very religious society. And so there is this underlying religious meaning to a lot of these works as well. Pomegranates are sometimes seen as a symbol of Christ. Again, you have the sense of rebirth and all the seeds that a pomegranate has. So Peter Klaas, still life. The details on this are just absolutely remarkable. Peter Klaas, Vanitas with violin and glass ball, 17th century. And another term for the symbols of death, like for instance, when you see a skull or you see a shell, those are called symbols of death. And a memento mori can be a ring that has a skull on it. And so these vanitas symbols often show up in these works. And keys, feathers, just objects that are here now and they're not always going to be. The reflection, there's a reflection in the window. It's a cross. That's intentional. Yeah, you know, if they could add religious iconography in 17th century art, they often did. And so a still life, still leven, still leben, still life, these are all referring to still lifes. This glass was often this kind of larger glass like this. It's often referred to as a rummer, and it was a drink that a man would use. A woman's glass was generally much smaller and more delicate. But the gazing ball that you see here, and then the music, there was a lot of question about whether music and dancing was sinful. And again, generally speaking, they believed in moderation. So moderation in all these things. But then there were some that were very religious that were disdainful of music and dancing. So, but again, these are the things that will pass away. And the skull is a common memento mori, or symbol of death. So here you can actually see the artist in his studio. It's a blow-up of it. Clara Peters, unusual to have an important artist that was a female in the 1600s, in the 17th century. And she also sometimes signed her works with her reflection. Sometimes you'll see her initials show up in the way that pretzels are laying in the foreground. The flowers here, they do not look fresh. They look like they've been there a little while. So there is that sense that this is a vanitas subject. So still life with flowers and gilded objects, 1612. Now, where do I find this little signature or reflection of the artist? Let me show you. So if you look really closely at this hollowware, this very, very decorative hollowware, this again, this would be a breakfast piece. This would be something somebody would show to basically show that they have these luxury items in their home. And where were these paintings? These were paintings that were in luxurious homes. If you had a painting, you were wealthy. If you had a book, you were wealthy. For a long time, you know, the printing press starts in the 1400s, but wide spread of books. You really don't have a lot of that until even the 1800s. But even so, paintings, these were something for the very wealthy. Okay, let's move on. Some Christian iconography. You have a lily for purity, a rose, red rose for martyrdom, blood, also sometimes represents the Virgin, also sometimes a symbol of Christ. A white rose, purity. You can figure out some of these. A rose with thorns to remind men of sin, and Mary's robe was usually white for purity. red for blood, Passion of Christ also, and sometimes she's shown in blue as Queen of Heaven, and so it's sometimes a very rich blue. And so that was also something that was often part of Mary's iconography. And here we have a medieval Cimabue work contrasted with Botticelli's more Renaissance tondo. You have this round tondo. And you can see how the baby looks much more realistic. In medieval times, the baby looks much more like a little old man. And part of that was intentional. They were painting this Son of God, and they wanted it to not be too realistic. Now, by the time we get to the Renaissance, we do see more realistic babies, particularly Raphael and others. But Botticelli, this is a tondo. And if you look closely, the Queen, or the Queen of Heaven, or the Virgin, is also the same model that you saw in Botticelli's Birth of Venus, and also in Birth of Venus, and then also in Primavera. So, and again, he was often working with the Medicis. Now, sadly, Botticelli destroyed a lot of his mythological works in the Bonfire of the Vanities. Savonarola was this very religious figure, and he was fervent that anything that wasn't religious in art should be destroyed. So sadly, a number of them were. So this is Sandro Botticelli's Madonna Magnificat. And the Magnificat is a particular passage that describes the Virgin, and where she talks about her soul magnifies the Lord. So here you can see a detail of it, 1481. Now, interestingly, this is actually tempera. And it doesn't have the same reflective qualities that you're going to see in oil. But even so, it's really quite incredible that he did this in tempera. So tondo is also a term we sometimes use, and that's a circular format in art. The circular format in art became very popular during the Renaissance. The Master of Flamel, Robert Campin, probably Robert Campin, and this is one of the first artists to really, really develop the use of oil painting, and he's the one that's kind of credited with it. Again, people had done a little bit of work in oil. The Romans had done some in caustic. They'd also done some oil painting, but not really developed it. By the time we get to Robert Campin, he's starting to really develop it. And he's using oil on wood. This is a triptych. A triptych is a 3-panel artwork that's often religious. Religious triptychs show up for centuries. And again, now looking here, even if you don't know art history, even if this is your first art history class, you could probably guess at some of the symbols. And again, look at all the details and go, well, is that a symbol? Or maybe that's a symbol. This is absolutely symbol laden. I could probably do a whole lecture on it, but I won't. But I will show you a number of slides to kind of show you some of the details in this. First of all, she's holding a holy book, and she's holding it with basically this cloth, kind of showing that it's sacred. You have a lily in the center panel that can be connected to the Virgin, as can the rose. You have a prayer shawl hanging in the back. You have little teeny tiny, if you look by those small round windows, there's a figure on a cross, and that's the Holy Spirit, and there's this little tiny infant on the Holy Spirit that is basically coming into to the Virgin. And so this is an Annunciation scene. This is that scene where the angel Gabriel, in our history, the Annunciation scenes, there's a lot of them, thousands of them. There's an Annunciation means where the angel Gabriel comes down to the Virgin to say that she is going to bear the Christ child. And on the side here, you have the patron. It's as if he's looking into this room. And so he is basically is commissioning this work. And by commissioning these religious works, it's one way to kind of ensure a higher place in heaven, to commission these incredible works. And they believe that the woman was added later, and that would be his wife. She has her hair covered, which would have been something that women in this time period would have done. They would have had their hair covered. I mean, we look at her and we think she looks like a nun, but no, that is the patron's wife. And then in the very back, you have a soldier, and then you also have a rose flower bush. So all of these details are all tied to symbols. Now, the older figure on the other side, that is Joseph. Joseph, of course, was the much older husband to the Virgin Mary. And so we see Joseph in his workshop with his carpenter tools, and there's a little tiny mouse trap in the background. And in addition, if you look in the very, very back, you can see a Flemish town. You're like, wait, this is from the Bible. Why do we have the Flemish town in the background? I'll get to that. So let me show you some details. So here you can see that little tiny figure coming in on a cross, and again, that is the depiction of the Holy Spirit. And if you count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it's coming in on 7 rays. And the number 7 is a sacred number in the Christian Bible. And, 7 days, some say allegorical, some say, that's the exact truth. But 7 days the world was made. And then you also have 7 fruits of the Spirit. And then you also other numbers that are important in the Christian Bible: 3, the Trinity, 12, the 12 disciples. And some of these numbers seem to recur over and over and over again. 40 days and 40 nights. So there's certain numbers that are, again, tied to Christian iconography and symbols. One of my favorite details is you see the pot hanging in the back. You see this kind of cooking pot that's just been hung up. Well, it's empty. That is believed to be connected to a symbol for the Virgin's womb. Indeed, the Virgin is empty, and that is going to change, and this is that moment. And so all of these details, even her humility, the way that she sits below at this kind of prayer bench, and she sits below, this is showing her humility. And she's not dressed really lavishly. She's still elegant, but she also is very, very humble as well. Let's move on. So the Annunciation, again, these Annunciation scenes sometimes occur in Mary's house. Sometimes the angel actually gives her a white lily, and I can think of a number of them. So from St. Luke, "Thou art highly favored, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. Thou shalt conceive in thy womb and bring forth a son." And so here, and I am quoting something from Ferguson, Signs and Symbols in Christian Art. It's kind of an art history symbol Bible. So Mary's robes tend to be red, white, or blue. Easy to remember. And so dark blue mantle. Blue is Byzantine in origin, the color of an empress, queen of heaven. Blue also tied to sapphires and the sky. Red, popular color to represent Mary in the beginning of the 10th. And by the 14th century, she's often showing a red robe instead of a blue. The color red is symbolic of nobility, suffering, passion. And the classical representation of Mary is with a red robe and a blue mantle. And you see that quite a bit in art history, particularly the blue mantle. So over and over and over again, these are the sort of colors that are in art history. Now there's exceptions, but again, that kind of helps you. This is a detail of rosemary, and according to legend in medieval time periods, Mary put her blue cloak over the rosemary bushes, and the rosemary bushes had white flowers. And after Mary laid her blue cloak over the rosemary with white flowers, it changed them to blue. So it was a story from the medieval period. So lots of legends, lots of folklore, again, Christian doctrine, and all of these things. It was a very, very religious time period. We are much more secular today, but in art history, particularly in Western art history, there is a great deal of Christian iconography. When I was studying art history, I was sometimes a little bit envious of my friends that have the Roman Catholic background, because these were things that they were more cognizant of. So this again it just shows the details that again are just really, really quite remarkable. Yeah. So Master of Flamel, or Robert Campin, again 1500s, boiling water in the background are common signs of her purity. 7 rays near the Christ figure. So from Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And fear here doesn't necessarily mean fear like scary movie fear. It means respect. Wisdom, understanding, counsel, fortitude, knowledge, piety, and fear. So a detail of the Flemish city is in the background of this particular frame. And in the background behind the soldier, you can see architectural details that are reflective of a Flemish town as well. Why? Well, they believe it was to make it more accessible. So that, for instance, if you were looking at the triptych in this time period, well, then you might see a view of LA in the background. And the idea being, it just makes it more accessible. You're not looking at a biblical view. You're not looking at Jerusalem. You're looking at something that they could relate to more. And so it was a tool that they used to make the viewer feel more connected. Now, mind you, not all of the viewers would have been literate. So art often works as a way to make the text very, very much visible to people that might not otherwise know the stories. So it's interesting that it was a tool like that. So this is symbol laden. Now, an axe at the bottom. It's not shown in this frame. There's a saw, there's a rod. Shall the axe boast itself against him that heweth it, or shall the saw magnify itself as if it were no wood? This is from Isaiah, and this particular frame was something that people who were familiar with Christianity, were familiar with the book of Isaiah, they would have recognized some of these details. They would have recognized the details with the connection to Joseph. We don't. We have to do a little more research to kind of find out what the typical meaning was. So again, here you can see a blow-up of the details. And the mousetrap, in medieval time periods, the mousetrap was actually associated with a symbol of the devil. And the idea was that there's this mousetrap in the window, and that's to keep the devil away. This is a holy place. This is a triptych. This is a sacred moment. And so the mousetrap is actually, in medieval times, this was associated more with Satan and evil. Kind of interesting. So So now you know probably way more about this than you ever wanted to, but there it is. Jan van Eyck's Madonna of Chancellor Roland. This is 15th century. And now this is a pretty important person. If I'm looking at this, I'm going, wow, he kind of thinks he's all that. Well, first of all, look at his clothing. It's very lavish. It's very important. His facial expression is very, very serious. And he's almost eye to eye with the Madonna. He's almost eye to eye with the Virgin. Here she has an angel right above her, crowning her Queen of Heaven. The rainbow wings are something that was typical in Jan van Eyck's work. He often has those beautiful, incredible medieval rainbow-hued wings. And then the figure of the Christ child, again, kind of transitional, not as realistic as you're going to get in Italian Renaissance, but certainly not as stiff and formal as you have in medieval art as well. And so here she's shown in a red robe. And if you look out, there's two figures that are looking out. This is the artist actually putting a self-portrait of himself in the painting. Jan van Eyck is believed to have painted himself in a red turban, and so you see this red turbaned figure in the middle to the back looking out over the countryside, and then next to him you see Herbert, his brother, who was also a painter. Jan van Eyck was the more famous of the two. Herbert died before Jan van Eyck. So watercolor, transparent, opaque, and again it is sometimes transparent, but sometimes it's heavier and you can't see through it. Sayre states watercolor can be the most expressive, but it's also the less control for the artist. Watercolor is much more difficult to control. It's just the nature of watercolor. Egyptians used watercolor in papyrus. So Winslow Homer, known for his incredible watercolor, really, really very talented in watercolor. And his works most commonly have themes of man against nature. So Winslow Homer associated with themes of man against nature, or here we see a younger man. And so this is a young hunter lying in a boat, tightly holding a noose in one hand and a dead deer in the other. His attention is on the dog swimming to him. After having killed the deer, the boy's task is to secure it and haul it into the boat or tow it on shore. The dog must be lifted into the boat. And so it's really, really interesting because it's pondering all those questions. And, you know, hunters would have looked at this and understood the conflict right away. And so this idea of man against nature, the common theme in Winslow Homer's work. He also did a number of these type of images of the Bahamas and Florida, and this is Key West hauling anchor. This is a 1903 watercolor, and you can see again the translucent washes in the foreground, and the attention to detail for watercolor is just amazing. And here's a blow-up, so you can see a bit more of the details. You can even see the texture of the canvas as well. Gulfstream, man against nature. Again, here's another theme. Now, this was not particularly popular, largely because I think the subject matter. And here we have sharks. It looks dangerous. It's probably not one of those things that most people would want hanging above the couch. You know, usually we want something more appealing, an ocean scene, flowers, an abstraction. But here indeed we see this man that is actually lashed into this boat. He no longer has a sail. He is basically at the mercy of these waves, and you just don't know what's going to happen. You have a bit of a diagonal. Whenever you have a diagonal, it's the artist is generally trying to kind of create some friction or discomfort in the viewers, this strong diagonal going through. But he's very, very vulnerable. Now, it's notable that Winslow Homer used a black man in this work, especially in the time period in which he was painting. But you do see his treatment of blacks that is done in a much more humanistic, certainly not racist way for his time period. He was unusual. And so, and the fact that this black figure is the central figure, and again, very much the focal point, was really unusual for the time in which he was producing art. So he was going to Bahamas in the 1880s, 90s, first exhibited at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in 1900. And it was also, he touched up and improved it later. I saw this in a museum on a special exhibit a number of years ago, and it's unbelievable how beautiful it is. Slide does not do it justice, not even close. I'm pretty sure I saw it at the LACMA, but it was one of those works that was just astounding. The artist placed on the picture the record-breaking price of $4,000, and that would have been a humongous number in this time period. But again, it had mixed reactions because of the theme. Gouache, and it sounds more like G-W-A-S-H, gouache. Watercolor that's deeper, essentially watercolor mixed with white Chinese chalk. It becomes less transparent, more opaque. Give me a choice of painting with watercolor or gouache. I will pick gouache. Gouache is thicker, it has a little bit more body, a little more control. And so it also, gum arabic, principated chalk, here's the official name. Pigments are the basis of all watercolors and gouaches. The addition of a humectant such as glycerin improves watercolors dramatically. So, but again, gouache is a really interesting medium. One of the persons that's most famous for it is Jacob Lawrence. And so he was a very important black artist. Now, will we ever get to a point where we just say artist, not woman artist, not Japanese artist, just American artist, or who knows? But certainly he was very, very important. And he was also one of the Harlem Renaissance artists. And he is often painting the everyday experience of Harlem. Again, this was a Renaissance period, Harlem in this particular area of New York. And he paints what he sees, what he hears. This is the Jazz age, certainly influenced him. Perhaps his most famous work is Barbershop. And you have the repeated triangles. The color wheel. And here, of course, you can see, let me see how I can do this. Opposite on the color wheel, colors like cobalt blue with orange and yellows, those are opposite on the color wheel. Greens are opposite. Here you have greens and they're opposite reds. And these are colors that look appealing against each other. So complementary or opposite on the color wheel. Sometimes you have what we call triads, which are basically divided up in three parts. But in any case, analogous colors, those are ones that are next to each other on the color wheel. And it's kind of a great tool, for instance, if you're decorating or you're painting, because you kind of know what goes with what's going to really make it pop. A really good picture looks as if it's happened at once. It looks as if it was born in a minute. Helen Frankenthaler is one of my favorite artists. She was painting with Jackson Pollock, and the abstract expressionist, also known as the New York School. She was using synthetic paints. We would call it acrylic, but it had different terms when she was using it. Magna, synthetic paints, and ultimately it becomes acrylic paints. Now the benefit of acrylic paint today is it's better for the environment. Oil paints, not as much, although they're starting to develop some oil paints that aren't as harmful. First used in the 1940s, their use has rivaled that of oil paints because they're so versatile. They're a little more washable too if you get it quick, not if it sits for a while. And in transparent washes, or you can use a heavy impasto. Impasto means a heavy application of paint. Acrylic paints dry quickly, sometimes too quick, frankly, and can clean up with soap and water most of the time. And so this is Frankenthaler, The Bay, 1983. Again, abstract expressionist Helen Frankenthaler. Magic Carpet, 1964. Her works are often large. She pointedly wanted to use works that were large. Abstract expressionists were working with a lot of large format paints. So she used sponges and other tools to manipulate the paint. Here you can see some of the scales in which she's working at. She's using scraping techniques. She's using different tools to manipulate the paint. So certainly she was experimenting with some of the ideas that, for instance, Jackson Pollock was experimenting with, this idea of action painting, moving, and really being involved in the paint process. Buddha's Court. She produced a number of these in slightly different colors, but they have a lot of the same format and structure and form. Creates veils of color using the soak and stain method that she was known for. So she worked in acrylic resins and 1950s and 60s. I actually like working with acrylic the best. I love the brand Golden. These are professional grade quality paints, and the difference between perhaps a student grade or a professional grade, oh my gosh, so different. But in any case, but she was using a very, very early generation of that. Claude Monet, working in oil paints. He was rejected over and over and over by the Paris Salon. Poplars produced in 1890s, and certainly artists get preoccupied with stuff that you see over and over. Degas very much was inspired by ballerinas, did a number of ballerina paintings and drawings and works. He'll pop in occasionally, so in any case. It's easier now that I have one dog compared to when I had three. So this is Robert Rauschenberg's Monogram, 1950s. This is definitely mixed media. You have sculpture qualities, you have paint. It's a combine, and that term combine is associated with Rauschenberg. So here you have a stuffed Angora goat, a tire, and see Dada as far as the D and the A in there. And he's basically alluding to the fact that this is very much a different type of art and very experimental. You're thinking 1950s, this was just wild for the 1950s. Untitled Medici slot machine series, Joseph Cornell, he was known for these found objects. He's associated with the found objects. He would literally collect little bits that he would find. He was a little bit of a hoarder if you ever saw his studio. And he would collect these objects and put them together in very unique ways and very analytical in a way. But Joseph Cornell was producing these in a time period when a lot of people did not understand what he was doing. Now it's not so shocking, but in its time it was. So found object in surrealist theory, an object of any kind, such as a shell on a walk, toys. One person's trash is another person's treasure. I have to admit, if I'm walking down the beach and I see a Barbie arm or something interesting laying on the beach, I might pick it up and put it in my pocket. It might show up in something. And so artists have been doing that for a very, very long time. Tomaselli, Airborne Event. This is a very interesting mixed media. His mixed media often includes pills, little tiny pills, and particularly Benadryl. They're hot pink. But in any case, I went to a Tomaselli exhibition in Oceanside. Incredible details, just these little tiny pills. He's a pretty well-known artist, and again, I would say he has an international reputation now. Some of you may have heard of you, some of them you not, but in any case, he is an intriguing artist. So these pills, leaves, marijuana leaves, insects, butterflies, other cutouts, little bits of collage pieces often do show up in his work as well. But they're very, very meticulous. I mentioned that I went to an exhibit in Oceanside, and my husband's much more analytical than I am. I'm the creative one. And he loved this exhibition because it was so exact and so meticulously rendered. He was like, oh, yeah, I like this, but doesn't always like all of it. Yes, he went to Cal State Fullerton, so he is a local. Born in 1956, Santa Monica, now currently based in New York. Holds a BA in painting, and again, he's also lived in Anaheim for a while. He said he was very influenced by the Magic Kingdom. That sort of fantasy very much informs his art. So The Last Frontier also alludes to Star Trek, and so these are these little very, very specifically rendered images that he did of stars. And so doesn't only do pills. In fact, he's kind of gotten away from it, but that's what he, of course, is well known for. He was a surfer into the punk and new wave music scene, a creator of multimedia installations, and he freely admits an avid consumer of mind-blowing drugs. I'm not promoting that. Then, not long after moving to Brooklyn in the mid-1980s, he settled into middle-class, life-oriented, more to family and tending backyard gardens. That was 2010. So this is Tomaselli. This is a mural, and it's by Tomaselli. And a few years back, they had a number of these murals all around La Jolla. You could actually go on tours. And this is Expecting to Fly for the Zeros, an homage to Neil Young's Buffalo Springfield composition, Expecting to Fly, and this legendary, albeit short-lived, Chula Vista punk rock band, The Zeros. So this is from the magazine La Jolla Light. So this is Tomaselli's artwork that he created for La Jolla, and of course you can see it's pretty large. Last artwork, and this is by Judy Baca, B-A-C-A, and it's Great Wall of Los Angeles. It's a mile-long mural that's in the Tujunga Wash, and it has had to be revitalized and redone because of graffiti and just time, frankly, and lots of themes of social unity, and certainly we can use more of that. And so the title refers to the Great Wall of China, but this is the Great Wall of LA. Again, it's a mile long. Again, one of the themes of Judy Baca's work. And of course, the title refers to the Great Wall of China, 7th century before Common Era. An incredible landmark, supposedly visible from space. So huge, huge architectural structure. So thank you, and again, I hope that gives you a little bit better understanding of paint in general.